Ramos to become ambassador for Hungary in England. And he has done so for 2 years, 16. And I think that the main reason for that was for Hungary to make use of the business skills, knowledge, acumen, professional attitude of Peter Sarbatz. Sorry, Peter. And that is what he said yes to. And he will now talk about his experience in London for 2 years with the subject, the impact of strategic thinking on diplomacy. Peter, may I give you the floor?
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I recall being here about 4 years ago, just before leaving to London, when I joined this illustrious crowd as a member. And I'm happy to be back to share my experience. It is my speech today will not be very theoretical. It will be very much based on my own experience. But the title of my speech is what the impact that strategic thinking can have on international diplomacy. And the reason I chose that title is because when I first arrived in London, after my introduction, we had our first staff meeting, and of course we went through a lot of different protocol. And the second staff meeting that I had, I then recommended, and I asked the group of diplomats around the table, that we would go through a strategic planning process. And you can imagine the glazed eyes that I got from my colleagues, because none of them have actually done so. Because here I was, an ambassador coming from the business world, asking them to do something that they had never done before. So I obviously took my experience from business, but I made it a very, very simple process. And there were many, many advantages to that simple process. Number one, it was an important process for getting to know each other. So team building, right? Because we were not only there as a management group, but we spent 2 months together every week thinking through what would be important for us over the next 4 years. Equally important was that through that process, we actually decided to use, it happened naturally, the same terminology that we each then got used to using. So through that strategic planning process, we always knew when we said a word what it is that we were all thinking of. And that was actually very important. But the primary reason for doing strategic planning was to define our goals. Because then I asked, when I saw these glazed eyes in front of me, I asked them, well, how will we know 2, 3, 4 years down the road whether we will have achieved anything? And of course, they couldn't answer that question. And I said, well, that's why we need to go through this process. And so I do hope that you can see. I'd like to put up on the screen the very first thing that we did during this process. And that is, first we had to define in which areas we would be formulating these strategic goals. And you can see that it was in politics, in in economics, both trade and investment, and city relations, in culture, media. Very important, we had separately at first the teaching, and we had separately from teaching the science and technology, but we then brought those together. We had a chapter on religion or church, what sort of strategic goals we could achieve there. And of course we had a consulate. We had many Hungarians living in the UK, approximately 150 to 200,000. And of course we had to understand the difference between being efficient and effective. So those were the categories, and of course there were subcategories to each one of these. And through the process we formulated at least 5 strategic goals that we would want to achieve in these categories and subcategories. But can you imagine, when we finished, we had all of these strategic goals, and when we added them all together, we found that we had about 75. And we said, how can we really focus on 75 goals? Impossible. Even though, we were probably the second largest embassy that Hungary had. We had 43 employees. But still, to focus equally on 75 strategic goals is just not going to make it. So then we decided that we would have to sort of prioritize each one of these goals, no matter which category, which chapter they actually were formulated in. And we said, well, the overriding objective of our embassy in London would really be twofold. One would be, each one of these strategic goals had to be evaluated from the perspective of how it could benefit from the bilateral relations that Hungary has with the UK. So in other words, we then created a priority list of the 75, trying to quantify or estimate how it could impact on improving bilateral relations between the two countries. So that was one overriding objective. The second overriding objective was, taking all of these strategic goals into consideration, which ones would have the largest impact on showcasing Hungary, showing Hungary's best side, improving Hungary's image. Yeah. And so again, we did a priority listing. And of course, we were interested in the top 5, because those were the ones that we would actually focus on. And I'm happy to tell you that we were actually very surprised that in the top 5, 2 of them came from the chapter we called Church and Religion. It certainly surprised us. Nobody would have said before we started that 2 of the strategic goals that we formulated in church relations, that they would have the biggest impact, we think. And so, on my story today is to share with you what the top 1 actually was and how we made it happen. And that top strategic goal actually happened to all revolve around something that even people in Hungary don't know very much about. And that is that we have in Esztergom a relic of St. Thomas Becket. Very few people know that even in Hungary. And that relic has been there in Esztergom, revered and kept solemnly for over 800 years. And of course, St. Thomas of Becket is a very important character in England, a historic character. And so our idea was, why couldn't we bring that relic to England? And that was the idea. And the reason it turned out that we thought that that would have the highest impact was because all these other strategic goals that we formulated in the other chapters, they all could become part of that visit, bringing the relics of St. Thomas of Becket to the UK. And so that's what I'm very happy to now share with you. This is actually the relic. It is a piece of St. Thomas of Becket's arm. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but there's a newly made custodial holder, and inside is the piece of his arm. That is the relic that we took to Great Britain. It took 2 years of organizing, and there were many, many aspects to making sure that this would be a diplomatic success. And right in the beginning, the biggest challenge I had was to make sure that the Anglican Church would be involved, would fully embrace this initiative. Obviously, because only 10% of British people are Catholic. So my very first trip after we had decided this was to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I came to him and I said, well, look, I have this fantastic idea. We have the relic and we'd like to bring it to the UK. We'd very much like the Anglican Church to be involved. And the Archbishop very quickly responded, very pragmatically. And he said, well, if this sort of visit is going to be about lauding or praising this relic, then venerating was the word he used, venerating the relic, then we're not really that interested. It's not so interesting. But, Your Excellency, he said, if we can make this visit a real pilgrimage with lots of people involved, especially school children, local governments, and so on, then we will fully embrace it. Well, I said, well, of course, that's what we were thinking about, a pilgrimage. And so that's what it became, a 1-week pilgrimage. And the 1-week pilgrimage essentially was 5 days in London, 1 day or half a day in Rochester, which was on the way to Canterbury, and the final 2 days in Canterbury, which is where St. Thomas of Becket was martyred. And this is the relic that we then took to London and to Rochester and on to Canterbury. Now, I'm going to show you a few pictures of actually, not all of them because I don't have that much time, but a few pictures of some of the events that took place during this pilgrimage. So but actually before I do that, I'd like to actually share with you how historic an occasion this became. It happened to be that the day that we started, the day that the relic arrived, was actually the day, 854 years ago, that St. Thomas of Becket became the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was on the very day, May 23rd. And it was 800 years ago, we don't know exactly, but roughly 800 years ago, that the relic ended up in Esztergom. It was the first time that it returned to England. And thirdly, it is the first time since Henry VIII, as you know, Henry VIII destroyed all of the body parts of St. Thomas of Becket in Canterbury during his reign. And so all of the remaining relics, and there were about 5 or 6 that we know of in the world, they were reunited for the first time since Henry VIII. So these were the historic occasions that we could announce during the visit. And the very first day, the relic arrived, escorted by the President of Hungary, János Áder, as you can see, showing he very quickly was on board. As when I told him about my idea, he didn't think twice. He said, "When you organize it, I will be there." And he certainly was. He spent 2 very important days in London. Part of the historic occasion was the fact that it was also occasion to bring Catholics and Anglicans together. And so at this opening Mass at Westminster Cathedral, which is where we see this, you can see in the front row the Anglican leaders, the Bishop of London, the Archbishop of Westminster, not Archbishop, they call them Dean of the Westminster Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, and other Anglican high-ranking clergy. There were actually 54 priests concelebrating at this opening Mass, and it was Primate Erdő Péter Erdő, who was celebrating the Mass at the church. And here you can see, just to give you a feel for how many people, actually this is the end of the Mass with the leaving ceremony. So the number of people who actually attended. We were a bit scared, you never know. Of course, it's one thing to actually read in the media, but we weren't sure how many people would actually take the time to actually attend and be part of it. Well, Westminster Cathedral was full, as you can see in the picture. Now, media was actually a very, very important part of the process, and I just want to show you I'm not onto internet, but Mail Online, which is equivalent to Index here in Hungary, one of the most popular online portals, had a huge article with lots of pictures of the event. So the media part of it was actually very, very important in making sure that we had the appropriate impact. This occasion also allowed for President Áder to meet Prime Minister David Cameron. And of course we didn't know at the time when we were organizing this, but the pilgrimage happened 1 month before the Brexit referendum. And so, of course, we had many, many key messages, not too many, but 3 key messages that we always said during our correspondence. And always the first one was that this pilgrimage and St. Thomas of Becket relic really represents the centuries-old manifold historic relations that Hungary has had with Great Britain. And so, a very small anecdote, the President Áder actually met Prime Minister David Cameron about 5 months before, because as you may remember in 2016 January, then Prime Minister David Cameron came to visit Budapest. But he again hosted President Áder, and President Áder's first words were, well, David, they were on a first name basis. He said, David, well, I think you will be very happy that I am one of the few, probably the only heads of state that does not want to talk about Brexit. And certainly that topic was not on the agenda. So after Westminster Cathedral, the relic went on to Westminster Abbey, where it could be visited for 5 days. Many people did so. Here you can see the abbot receiving the relic. You can see President Ader being received by the President of the Parliament, the Upper House. This was a very high-level dinner organized at Draper's Hall in the city, which is usually organized for heads of state in official visits. This was not an official visit. President Ader also visited the Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor, protocol-wise, is the number 2 person in Great Britain after Her Majesty the Queen. We had a lunch there. And after President Ader left, then the Speaker from Hungary met the Speaker of the Lower House in the Parliament in London. We also visited the birthplace of St. Thomas à Becket, which is actually in the city of London. Very few people realize, in Cheapside, in London. And there was a ceremony there. That's the Bishop of London on the right. He said the ceremony. And László Kisrigó from Hungary, Bishop of Szeged. One of the special moments was that we took the relic into the Parliament of London. And in the Parliament, every week on Wednesday evening, there is a Mass said in a very small, lovely church called St. Mary Undercroft Church. And there we took the relic, and the Mass was said there in the presence of that relic. There was a symposium organized in the Archbishop of Canterbury. He has a beautiful house in London, which he hosted us, and there were 300 people attending a symposium with many speakers talking about the relevance of St. Thomas à Becket for us today. Then we went on to Rochester, visited the Rochester Cathedral, where we had Vespers. The relic was displayed there as well. And we went on the next day, or on Saturday, to Canterbury, where we actually did have a pilgrimage. This is a 1.5 mile walking pilgrimage with Hungarian scouts leading the way. There is the picture of the long procession, 750 people arriving to the cathedral. And here you can see inside the service, the inside of the cathedral in Canterbury. After the service, the relic was brought down to the crypt, where it spent the night, and the following day on Sunday there was a Catholic Mass said in the crypt, again a historic occasion. It's not happened since Henry VIII. And the relic was then, in the very last sort of event, was brought to the very site of St. Thomas à Becket's martyrdom. This here is the site where he was murdered. And on this occasion, on the right side, there is a plaque that commemorates St. John Paul II, his kneeling down together with the then Dean of the Cathedral, of Canterbury Cathedral. You may remember in 1982, that was a very big event where the Pope and the Dean knelt together praying for the world. And it just so happened, again we didn't know when we started organizing this, that it was the very anniversary, May 29th, here we were, 34 years later. And there they were, Bishop Kiss László and the Dean of the cathedral doing the same 34 years later, remembering that. And in the end, the relic was brought back to this chapel, which is called the St. Thomas Chapel in Esztergom. This is where the relic is housed. So it's hidden a little bit, but it is there in Esztergom for you to see. So that's the case study that I wanted to give you, and I hope you're convinced that strategic planning played a big part in making that event a big success. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very open to any questions if you have.
Yes.
In addition to strategic planning, do you detect any divine intervention?
Well, I do. I'm glad you inferred. I mean, we didn't do that planning on exactly those days. Divine intervention had those dates planned for us.
Any other question? Yes. Yes.
Thank you. It was very interesting. And I have great respect for St. Thomas. But how does that make a difference in the English and Hungarian relationship? Especially when we know that many Hungarians go to England because they don't find a job in Hungary.
Right. Well, especially because of the timing of it, because it was 1 month before the Brexit referendum, it was a good chance to show and to showcase how long Hungary and the UK have been part of Europe. And that was the main message. And of course, we're very sad that the result of the Brexit referendum was for the UK to leave the EU. They didn't leave Europe, they left the EU. But that was the main diplomatic message, is that we are with you and we would like you to stay. And I think that went through. That message got through.
There is one.
Yes.
Somehow on the internet I found a document about this strategic planning and about the visit a few years ago. And my question is that what was the reaction here in Hungary? How were you rewarded for it, or how was it in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or
Yes.
today? So because I found it very interesting at this time, the strategic planning to find out something between the two countries and so on, it should be done by any other ambassador from Hungary.
Yes, thank you for that question. I was very proud, but of course it was the way I do business that we finally, we had for the embassy a strategic plan. So when we finished, then I was a bit unsure what I should do with it because, nobody asked me to actually prepare a strategic plan. So I went to my colleagues in the ministry here and I gave it to them. And you should have seen the unease that they showed when I gave it to them. And then I realized that immediately why? Because they asked, why are you giving this to us? Do you want us to approve it? Or do you want us to just see it as a best practice? And they were most worried about having to approve it. They were very worried about that because I wasn't asked to do it. But in the end, it was shown around as something that others could do. I was given a lot of freedom as ambassador because, I don't come from the diplomatic corps. And so I didn't go out to London with any particular instructions. I was expected to do the best job that I can do coming from the business world. And so I think I was a bit of an unknown in the ministry. And so there was sort of a curious waiting what would happen. And in the end, it was acknowledged. I did get one of the highest awards, the award of merit from the Hungarian award in August upon returning to Hungary. So I was recognized. Thank you.
Any other question? Charles?
Well, going back to St. Thomas of Becket, I mean, his murder was due mainly to his conflict with executive power. And he wanted to uphold the independence of the church and ecclesiastic courts and so on and so forth. And I think it had been, at that point in time in England, that was the only opposition to executive power, especially of the king.
Yes.
And but I was just wondering, did anybody think about how that might play against the Hungarian scene? I mean, this was really the first Orbán government, but still, it was interesting. I won't say that any kind of parallel, but did that come up at all, or was anybody worried about it?
Well, actually, I mean, your question is a very relevant one, because when we started, and we knew that the media needs to be managed, we thought a lot about what the key messages should be. And we defined 3 key messages that we always repeated. Well, that's what the media needs. 3 simple messages that they get after a while. And one of them I already mentioned is the relic represented the many centuries old historic links between the 2 countries. The second key message was that this was an opportunity, this pilgrimage, for all of us, any of us, to contemplate what St. Thomas of Becket means to society or what it means to us. So this was an opportunity. Hopefully people would take advantage of it. Because you're right, St. Thomas of Becket can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And the third key message was that, St. Thomas of Becket is relevant in Hungary. It certainly was very relevant in Hungary. Because he was revitalized under Cardinal Lékai in 1977, when St. Thomas of Becket became sort of the epitome under communism of fighting against the government oppression, against religious liberties. And so that's how Becket became important for Hungary. And that's what we were really emphasizing. We didn't want to make this a current political sort of event. We wanted to bring it more historic.
Any more questions? Then it's time for us to thank you very much, Peter. It was, of course, very interesting and also a very good example that if you make a presentation in the way of a story, you have the audience then spell out. And your way of presenting it, very, very interesting. It was unique, and therefore you can already guess what that uniqueness means if you this little present. And then we take it out. Dus met dat staan even mee. We have the buffet waiting for us and the coffee, so we apparently all are a bit silent, a bit quiet now, thinking of what we heard just from Peter Sabbath. And if you would like to come and have your private questions, please come. Thanks.